Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Lookout. Today's the 22nd of August, and today we're going to talk about the fires in Six Rivers. Yesterday, the fire over there, the Caldor Fire, made a pretty decent run, and so we're going to check that out, see what it did. We're going to talk a bit about fire severity and what fire severity is and how we quantify it and map it. We're going to talk about a little more about logging history in this area. We started to talk about that day before yesterday, or the day before that. And yesterday I got some satellite imagery showing some of the severity of this burn. And so I thought it'd be interesting to kind of just compare the logging history with the severity. And then I'm going to play maybe a little video and talk about taking care of forest land. So thanks for joining us. I'm going to jump right in here to maps. Before we start, I'll do my normal disclaimer that I'm not assigned to this fire. This is unofficial fire information. I'm not assigned to any of the fires that I cover on here. I've been doing fire intelligence work since about 2000. And so I'm basically interpreting publicly available information on this channel to give you an idea of what happens, and it's almost always based on imagery that's 10 to 12 hours old that was captured the night before. So imagery I'm going to show today is from about 11 p.m. last night of the fire from an infrared scan. All right, we got two logos. That's no good. Let's get rid of one of those. All right. So we're going to start off as we have been, looking over Willow Creek. And hang on a second, I got to turn on my magic mouse thing here. So we can see where we're pointing. All right. So we're looking kind of east over Willow Creek. This kind of dark mottled area is everything that's burned already. Yellow are places that are still kind of scattered heat. The black is all pretty much cooled off. On this map, planned fire lines are shown in purple. Blue are areas where roads have been prepped. Black are dozer lines, and brown are hand lines. And this red is just kind of the perimeter of the fire. It doesn't mean there's any heat there. It's just kind of the color that we're using to show the edge of the polygon there. So, big news yesterday, obviously, giant smoke cloud, and the fire ran about 2 miles up Cedar Creek. We got kind of some westerly winds, and basically the fire has been backing down here for 2 weeks. Fire started on top, originally as the Waterman fire, I think. Started up here, back down, and it's been steadily backing. It kind of hung up at the creek for a couple of days. There's been crews along the way that have put in fire line on this north slope to kind of try to hurt it, keep it from going up or down canyon. And they several times over the past 2 weeks have kind of put fire line in underslung, and the fire's kind of rolled out on them. So slope here is not super gentle. It's not crazy steep, but it's 30 to 60% slope, which is steep enough. And so the fire backed down here and crossed the creek day before yesterday. And as of about 11 o'clock last night, yesterday, the night before last, it was kind of down in here when they flew at about 8 p.m. And by the end of the evening, I think it kind of had pushed up to the ridge. This purple line here was planned fire line, and I still don't know. It's still showing on the ops map as planned fire line. I don't know if anything ever really got done there. We talked about this line about a week ago, and we said that, we thought that the fire would probably get down here, and if it crossed the creek, that this line was really unlikely to hold the fire unless they really prepped it and fired it. But that otherwise it was unlikely to hold a head fire coming up out of this canyon. So it's pretty much what happened. I don't know that any prep got done. but it's still on the map. Anyway, fires it ran about 2 miles. It grew about 1,000 acres in the last 24 hours. There's a spot out in front about 0.6 of a mile last night at, just before midnight. And that's the problem with kind of when these fires do make head fire runs, is that they don't really care much about a dozer line or, a hand line out ahead of them or a prepped road. The good thing about this spot is that there's a road right to it. The bad thing about that is that that road goes right through the middle of active fire to get there. So I don't really know what's going on. I think, one thing we can expect is just that in this country we have this alternating kind of, this fire now could spend, we just watched the other fire take 2 weeks to back down into a canyon that was real similar to this one. So, depending on what happens with the inversions, there's no reason that this fire won't also kind of back its way down into here for a week and then get a good day of weather and blow up and burn this drainage out. So it's kind of the nature of fire in this country is if you've got the inversions that stick around, you get big movement like this when the inversion lifts. And so last couple of days, smoke's cleared out earlier and fire was able to run. Depending on what the kind of continental weather's doing, we could just see the inversion pack back in, this fire smolder around for a week, see it take off again. This is kind of typical for fire in the Klamath. So other than that, there's not really any other growth to report on either branch of this fire. There's still some interior heat over here on the Ammon fire where they're firing. They're kind of finishing up firing this area that we've been watching over the last week where they came out to the roads here. So there's still some residual heat in there where the red is. As I said before, this red outline isn't heat. It's just the color that we're using to show the perimeter. So jumping out of there, I wanted to talk a bit about severity and fire severity and how we deal with it. I'm going to swap around here real quick. All right. So what's fire severity? Fire severity is the effects we get when a fire burns. And we're often talking about what's happening in timber. It seems like where we're most interested. Brush, a lot of times we have a fire in brush and it burns hot. All the brush turns black. And often that's not that big a deal because that's how brush burns. Chamise and, just California chaparral. Like it won't burn for a long time. And then when it burns hot. And it's kind of like that's not necessarily always a big deal. So it's like high severity fire isn't always a big deal. Some systems like lodgepole pine forest, subalpine fir, like they're set up for it where they have, we know that usually if we're going to have a fire in lodgepole, it's not going to happen very often. And when it does, it's going to burn all the trees up and it's not ecologically really a terrible thing. In mixed conifer, oftentimes, we see high severity fires being a bad thing because the watershed impacts. And oftentimes, because we're seeing high severity fire in places where we've suppressed fires for so long that we've got these really wild, heavy fuel loads. So we talk a lot about it as kind of being the most obvious thing you see when you see a burned forest. Is it all black sticks? Is there still a lot of green trees? Are there trees that have red needles? And one thing that we do is we kind of tend to break severity into low, moderate, and high severity. So low severity means that there's still green needles on the trees. Red or orange needles on the trees, but the trees are dead. We call that moderate severity. And then if all the trees are just black sticks, we call that high severity. And one of the reasons we do that is because from an erosion standpoint, it makes a big difference. Like if you have green needles still on the trees, oftentimes the canopy's intact. And one thing we're really worried about with post-fire erosion is rainfall and raindrop impact. So the direct impact of raindrops hitting the ground. So if you're talking about soil erosion and you've got a raindrop, a big raindrop that comes down, just bam, hits the ground and it bounces. When it bounces downhill and that carries soil particles with it. So having naked soil that are getting hit directly by rainfall, that's kind of a bad scenario for soil erosion. So even if all the trees are killed in the stand, but you have a lot of red pine needles still on the trees, those pine needles generally fall before winter. And then you end up with this kind of carpet of pine needles across your burn forest. And that's great for rainfall impact because then the rainfall is hitting pine needles. It's not hitting bare dirt. And the pine needles also can move around when you have little rills of runoff, and they can create these little dams. And so just having a layer of pine needles on the ground makes a big difference with soil erosion. So low, moderate, and high severity, oftentimes, it depends on who you're talking to, but if you're talking to like a hydrologist or someone who's doing like burned area rehab, we're interested in that kind of soil burn severity and the amount of pine needles still left on the trees to kind of help us figure out where the erosion is going to potentially be the worst. So one of the ways that we evaluate severity is we use satellite imagery, and kind of more, so this is a snapshot image that I got that was taken 2 days ago. This is a satellite called Sentinel, and it goes over every 5 days. So we take the infrared bands from that, and we can look at kind of photosynthesis. So these images kind of show you where there's still kind of active photosynthesis happening. And so where there's green, it means there's still kind of a lot of green pine needles. Where there's red, it means all the canopy's gone and you're kind of seeing bare dirt. So we kind of characterize, say like, okay, it's 50%. This fire's 60% high severity or 30% high severity. One thing that's interesting in this country is that traditionally we've tended to see that 60 to 70% of burns that happen in the Klamath and Trinity and kind of northwestern California are low to moderate severity. Over time, we're seeing some fires like Slater and these other big wind-driven fires like McKinney, where you have a lot higher proportion that are in that high severity. But over the last 30 years, a lot of the fires have happened just like this one, with big lightning bust, inversions, fires skunking around. So what I think is interesting in here is we talked the other day about logging history. So all these white outlines are clear cuts from the 60s and 70s. And a lot of places that I've been working in the last 20 years, I've been seeing that the fire severity seems to be higher in stands that have recently been clear cut. And so I was interested to see here that these older stands that have trees that are 50 to 60, between 40 and 60 years old, that they didn't burn as hot. So I think it'd be interesting to go out there on the ground and see why is that? What are the conditions like in these plantations? What is there kind of an age you get to where plantations are less susceptible? I've seen some places on the Klamath to the north of here, like during the Happy Camp complex, where a lot of the young stands really got roasted. So a big part of fire severity is what was the fire doing on the day that it burned through here? If we have a fire that starts in the bottom of a canyon and makes a big head run up the slope, we expect to see more high severity. With lightning fires, oftentimes the fire's backing, we see lower severity. So, I'm going to keep looking at this and hopefully get out on the ground here in the fall. We talked earlier a little bit about what does this mean for prescribed burning? When we talk about hey, there's this kind of prevailing attitude among foresters that we really have to do a lot more prep before we start doing prescribed fire, and that we have to thin a lot of stuff, that a lot of stuff is too thick for right now for us to go and put fire in it without thinning. And we talked about how that's kind of impractical on the landscape scale because we've got so many of these clear cuts, old clear cuts. And so to me, it's interesting that we were able to backfire through here during a wildfire, basically, and get low to moderate severity in these areas. And it'll be interesting to go out and see how many trees got killed, or how our conditions moving forward. There's kind of a discussion going on Facebook about this, where some of the foresters are really concerned about the amount of standing dead trees in these burns, even in moderate severity where you kill a lot of trees, and about what's going to happen when all those trees fall down. You can see here that the knob fire from last year, it had more high severity in it. A lot of that also has to do with, was this more brush? Was this, in these stands, it'd be interesting to know, were all the oak sprouts sprayed with herbicide in the 70s? Is there any brush under these? Or are they just kind of these tall, well spaced out kind of Christmas tree forests. So if anyone out there has some pictures out in the field of what it looks like in some of these old clear cuts that got an underburn, I'd love to see them. Coming back over here above Salyer, you kind of have these little islands of green in the burn where you had those previous clear cuts. And this clear cut here is a completed 1989. So about 33 years old. Smoke's laying in here, so you can't really see in a lot of it. And then this imagery was captured before the fire made its run here the other day. So we don't really know, we don't really see the severity. Expect that the big run yesterday with the big mushroom cloud, probably going to have a big kind of swath here of high severity. Anyway, that's the deal on that. I was going to show a little video here. Let's see. I just want to show yesterday, we talk about like the inversion lifting, and over the past days we've seen a lot of smoke packed in the canyons. Yesterday you can see that by like 2200 about 3 p.m. There's just no smoke laying in the canyons here. So we talk about like inversion lifts out, smoke's gone, and so you can see the fire kind of blow up here in the afternoon around 5 p.m. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with inversion over the next few days. It's supposed to be cooler, and the fuel moistures right now are actually pretty mild over there. They're almost like a prescribed burning kind of prescription. So, one reason this fire ran is because it had some good wind on it, and it had slope out ahead of it. The other thing I wanted to jump to here now is just little video and talk a little bit about I went out, we had a little like camp with our kids' school up at Camp Lassen, and that's it's up by Butte Meadows, and this forest has been thinned over the past there's parts of it that have been thinned and look pretty good from a fire perspective, and then there's parts that there's all these little baby trees. And so just as a kind of change of pace here, I want to talk a little bit about tending land and things you can do if you own land. Here I'm walking to the edge of this meadow, and there's all these little baby trees growing into the meadow here. And the meadow should be bigger. The forest is kind of taking over here. And it's something that's common in a lot of our meadow systems with fire exclusion, is that fire used to frequently, it'd burn through these meadows, and it would kill all these little baby trees on the edge of the meadow, and it would keep the meadow open. And so we call this encroachment, when the trees are growing out into area that should be meadow edge. And that's important just because, we've got plenty of thickets and we got a lot of forest, but meadows are kind of a finite resource. And it's not that hard to keep this from happening if you own some meadowland. So what I want to point out here is, like, if you look at all these little baby trees around this scene, you could go in here right now with a axe or Pulaski or pick, and in a couple hours you could clear out all these little trees. And obviously, like, if you're growing, if you're managing your land for timber production and you want to do commercial sales and stuff, like, it makes a lot of sense to hire a forester, and they can kind of give you a plan. This place has got a forester, and they've logged a bunch of bigger trees, but no one's really maintaining this little stuff. And then the reason it's important to come out here and maintain this stuff is, obviously, you want to leave enough little baby sprouts to fill in for your future forest. If you're going to cut out some trees down the road, you want to leave some. You want to be recruiting. It's like gardening. You want to kind of weed out the small sunflowers, but leave the tall ones. But the reason that you want to do this right now with your axe or Pulaski is that if you don't, it's going to look like this in 10 years, and in 20 years it's going to look like this, and then it becomes really difficult. You have to have a chipper. You have to hire someone with a chainsaw if you can't do it yourself. cutting down bigger trees is more dangerous. You got to find a place to put all this material. Some of it might be too big to burn in a burn pile. So the time to cut trees and kind of tend your land is when they're small. You know, you can come in here and you can cut all these things, and it barely makes a pile. You can even just leave them on the ground, you know, when they're this big. But if you wait too long, then it turns into this. So we're going to do a little video about kind of DIY land tending. But like, if you just look kind of through this land here, this is a Boy Scout camp. It's like we could turn loose 1,000 Boy Scouts over the next year and really change the outcome. If we don't do that, you know, pretty soon it's going to look like this, and that's a sick forest. You know, we looked around out here, and there's a lot of dead pine trees just because of drought stress and everything else. The drought stress is because all these little baby trees are sucking up water and competing. So if you've got land, got timberland, like, don't be afraid to cut some small trees down. It's like that's part of being a good steward. And really what you're doing here when you come in here and you cut all these things is you're simulating fire. You know, ideally we could put a little fire on the ground here at the right time of year, and just the fire would come around and kill all these. But I find it helpful when I'm walking around a stand like this to just think like you're fire, and think, if I was a little fire that was burning through here like it used to all the time, or if I was a native person burning here and I had little 4-foot flames, which trees here would I take out as fire? And then if you see a tree like, oh, the fire would definitely have killed that, then just whack it with your axe. You know, these little trees, like a little fire burning through these twigs here would kill a lot of these trees. So you can play fire on your own land. You don't need a permit to cut trees on your own land. You do need to deal with a forester if you're going to sell wood, if you're going to do commercial harvest. But be an active manager of your land. If you got an acre, walk around and whack some little fir. It's good for the soul. Anyway, that's about it for today. We'll keep doing little walks in the woods videos, and I can answer some questions. Can I speak to the severity of Caldor Fire in Silver Fork? Yeah, it might take a minute to load that up. We visited Willow Creek on Saturday and heard from locals that they have it 80% contained. Is that truth or local legend? It's pretty contained except for this part that just blew out. Like, the main part of the fire really hasn't spread much in the past week besides kind of the firing along the road. So, yeah, fire's pretty contained. That north end is going to do what it wants. Some of the old timber cut parcels are showing more green or photosynthesis. Does that mean they just burned less and more trees survived? Just that they're thick areas of young forest, and doesn't look like they got kind of holes punched in them by the fire. Not noticing much smoke. What are the best ways to volunteer and help out when I get there? I'd say talk to the volunteer fire department. Can you talk about economics of logging the burnt areas? Is there usable wood left after fires, high severity fires? And then someone says, we should be giving more attention to preserving and promoting grasslands, not the popular narrative that tree planting is better for carbon. Great. All good comments. Yeah, we can talk about logging and talk about Caldor Fire. I'll pull up a video here of logging. I know it's not fun to watch someone else drive a computer, but give me a second. All right, here's some, this is driving Highway 36, out from Chester, going towards, just driving along Highway 36 south of, kind of west of Chester. This area all got really high severity burn, and they're logging it. The burn, the high severity, yeah, it's all kind of charcoal and everything. It doesn't really affect the volume of wood. Like, it doesn't, you got a bunch of black sticks, but it's not really burning off like beyond the bark. So a lot of salvage going on in Dixie Fire in high severity areas, but especially near Chester and near the roads, because they've got a limited amount of time, 2 to 3 years to get the wood off the land before it's kind of not worth anything. And so how much logging they're going to get done really depends on kind of local conditions. Around Chester and Quincy and everything, there's just such a huge volume of burnt material right now that they don't have a place to put it all. So they're building huge log decks in the woods, but log decks that are at the mills, they have sprinklers on them, and that helps to preserve the wood and prevent it from kind of starting to lose its quality. So they're decking a lot of the stuff in the woods, but they're losing quality by the day. As long as they don't have it under sprinklers, it's just the wood is degrading in quality every day. So it's kind of a race to get it out. So a lot of places, it's just they're not going to get to it. They're starting here, near the mill in Chester and near the highway, because it's just the most economical thing to do is just to kind of start in the front and move to the back, is what people are saying. Anyway, it's pretty amazing how the volume of logging that has been done around Chester. And then there's also some trees that survived. There'd been a lot of thinning done along Highway 36 before the fire. And so in some places that helped, and in other places, fire just kind of ran through even stands that had quite a bit of thinning done. Regarding the Caldor Fire, and then someone commented here, the problem's getting to it before it's salvaged because of all the red tape, especially on the Forest Service land. The Forest Service really has lost a ton of their capability to really do anything with managing timberland. When they shut down logging with the spotted owl, they lost a huge amount of their foresters. A lot of their foresters went to work for Sierra Pacific Industries or other people who were still who needed their skill sets. So now when the Forest Service wants to get things done, often they get sued because there's a few people that really don't like post-fire salvage. And so the Forest Service tends to really only be salvaging along hazard trees along roadways. Private timberland, they're getting right after it. And there's not as much red tape on private timberland in California to salvage log. There's exemptions for fire salvage. So there's a lot of, there's plenty of, the foresters are kind of keeping ahead of the loggers on the Dixie Fire. But just the volume of material that's still left over, say, from the fires in 2020, the Bear Fire, the North Complex, there's a lot of wood that's backing up at the mills, and a ton of wood that's just not going to get out of the woods. So, when people are suing because they think we need more snags and that salvage logging is going to take out snags, we're not looking at a situation where we've got like a deficit of snags in the forest anywhere around Quincy in the next, 30 years. Okay, someone asked about Caldor Fire severity. It's going to take me a minute to bring it up, but it was also a real mix. Caldor, let's see, Kirkwood. Gotta find an image that doesn't have clouds in it here. Okay, here's an image. Here's Caldor Fire. This is the Sentinel imagery I was talking about. And so you can see kind of down here around Grizzly Flats, the fire made its initial run, started down in here and ripped hard to the north. And so what we were talking about before is like that the way that the fire burned when it went through a stand that's what creates the severity. And so, if a fire starts at the bottom of a hill and runs north, or if it starts in the bottom of a canyon and runs downwind, that affects the severity. You can see here actually the salvage logging that's been going on here along the Mormon Immigrant Trail. All these areas that are kind of lighter pink. So that tells you where the private land is. So the person's question was about the Silver Fork of the American down in here. And yeah, there was quite a lot of some high severity. What happened is the fire kind of spread from the west down into the Silver Fork, and then when it crossed the Silver Fork, it had the slope and the west winds to kind of carry it up out of there. So as we've talked about, we call that alignment. And so where the fire has alignment and it can run the slope, heavy fuels, and the wind all at once, you get high severity. But I think an interesting thing about Caldor is as you get into the higher elevations here, it was a real mixed severity. There's a lot of trees that are still green on this imagery. There was a burn out here that was called the Caples burn that was a prescribed fire that escaped, and it actually helped slow down the spread of fire here. Definitely along Highway 50, there was places where the fire just was aligned with the canyon, and it really just tore the high severity. And then there's places like Echo Lake where the fire backed down a north slope kind of out of the main wind over the course of a week and really left a lot of the big trees. Sierra Tahoe had really high severity. A lot. So, just a lot of it depends on where on the landscape you are and what's the history of that. Is it an old burn that has a lot of dead material? Is it an area that was logged in the past that had, heavy regeneration? Was it an area that was logged and then it was thinned and all the thinning material was just left on the wood, on the ground as kind of red slash? So when we talk about kind of how historic land use affects severity, all that stuff is interesting and matters, but a lot of it comes down to the day it burned and what the fire was doing that day. And was it a hot day? Was it a windy day? Was the fire blowing up the canyon? So it's pretty hard to generalize about severity. Why are snags important? And then someone says, yeah, we don't have the mills we used to, nowhere to process the kind of volume. It's sad. Yeah, and that's, I think, is unintended consequence of, there's always unintended consequences. So the unintended consequence, or maybe it's the intended consequence, of shutting down the woods because of the spotted owl, is that now we don't have the capacity, and we don't have the capacity to do a lot of thinning because we shrunk this industry. And the industry's kind of right-sized itself now to this new reality in which not much wood comes off the public lands. And so even if tomorrow we said, hey, we're going to get back to logging big time on the Forest Service lands and a ton of thinning, we don't have the workforce and we don't have the mills. And no big company is going to go spend $50 million to build a modern sawmill on a kind of lukewarm promise that we're going to keep doing this for 30 years, right? You do an investment like that, it's going to take you 20 or 30 years to pay it off. And so no one's going to go build a new sawmill in Quincy or Greenville or Placerville or anything tomorrow on the promise because one presidential administration says, hey, it's a priority for us to log the national forest. So economics, the big picture, global markets, they're all affecting that, us not rebuilding mills or just our capacity in general. Why are snags important? Yeah, snags are important for wildlife. They're important for woodpeckers. They fall down and become old logs that are important for, bears tear them apart and eat the grubs. And so you need to have this mix of snags, standing dead trees, and down logs to have kind of healthy wildlife populations, to have good soil. It's all kind of a mix. Salvage logging slows forest recovery, says Thomas Paulson. And Thomas is pretty awesome, from what I can tell, forestry student, fire student at Humboldt State. And it does, salvage is pretty gnarly. You go in and you clear cut this area, is just burned. There's nothing gentle about it. Mostly it's happening because the people who own the land, that's why they own the land, is to grow trees. And so they want to manage it for multiple objectives, and they need to keep the wildlife healthy and all that to comply with the laws. But salvage is brutal. It's nothing pretty about it. And that's not to say that it's worse than leaving the forest, the burnt forest, just to fall down and burn again hot. Looking at the Moonlight fire that burned 14 years ago, there's places there that the Forest Service didn't do anything and just left a bunch of snags and thick down wood and brush. And then the private companies came and clear cut and planted trees and sprayed herbicides, and they both look bad after the moonlight reburn. But some of the Forest Service land where all that stuff just piled up, nothing happened, and it burned again. It's just like, it looks like the moon, and the erosion is really bad. So it's tough to parse that apart. It's like, yeah, salvage, it slows forest recovery, but so does a reburn of a dense forest that didn't get any treatment. So, when we talk about managing our public lands in an ecologically sensitive way, nothing's black and white. It's something I've learned, just over my career, is like, I used to be a lot more polar. Salvage bad, don't do it. Now I'm seeing, the side-by-sides, and, we'll do some more videos on it. It's, I guess you got to check your dogma at the door with all this, because absolute compositions don't really, they don't serve the nuance of how complicated these conversations are. Need to take lessons from Indians about fire suppression in spring. They lit fires and managed it properly. Then someone else says, really, go look at Mount St. Helens. Salvage saved that whole forest. And then someone's asking Thomas Paulson how much time he spent in heavy burn areas after the fact. And I'm guessing not that many, because he's a young guy. Let's all go out in the woods, talking about this stuff. In theory, yeah, it's all happening out in the brush. We all got to keep talking about this stuff. We all got to learn from the old timers, and hopefully we can all be flexible and not hold on too tightly to any of the stuff we thought we knew. Someone says, all that thick downwoods, nothing but tinder. Leaving a portion of the biomass is valuable. Leaving all of it is often detrimental. Yeah, I agree. Anyway, I'm hoping to do some more videos here about this stuff. Kind of been in a crunch with my other job. It's fire season. But if you support the Lookout, you're going to help us kind of narrate this conversation. I appreciate all your comments and all your experience. If you want to float us a donation to kind of help us keep this thing going, check out our website, The Lookout, and there's a donate tab on there, and we appreciate all of it. Thanks for all the comments, and catch you all soon.